Hi everyone, 10 out of 10 Tano here, the internet's busiest Hobo Johnson fan, and it's time for a review of the 90s. This little YouTuber you may have heard of has been dropping these videos about 10 out of 10 albums from various decades, and while I think every album he's picked in these videos are perfectly valid, there's only like 5 mentioned in each one. I'm no mathematician, but I do know that there are 87,600 hours in a decade, and most of these albums are 40 minutes to an hour in length. That's a lot of time unaccounted for. Maybe I'm just way more trigger happy with my 10 out of 10 ratings than this guy over here is, but I figured I'd throw in my 2 cents and talk about some albums that I think are 10s from the 90s. I might do other decades as well, depending on if I feel like it or not, we'll see. We got 28 albums to talk about, so I'll get on with it.
This is the weekly song. It's song in which to
Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds have a discography that I'm not super familiar with, outside of a handful of albums, but The Good Son is absolutely fantastic. Nick Cave is mostly known for singing about fat boys' assholes and Huckleberry Finn fanfiction, but The Good Son was made at a time when he had just gotten with his first wife, Vivian Carnero, and it turns out I like him more when he's happy. Ish. The more mysterious post-punk and goth rock tendencies of his previous records have fizzled out a bit in favor of more theatrical, large-scale compositions, bringing in a whole-ass string section to make these songs pop. The core songwriting style is still distinctly Nick Cave, especially on some of the more ominous cuts like Sorrow's Child and The Hammer Song, not to be confused with The Hammer Song. Nick's vocals seamlessly carry the entire weight of the world with how smoothly they glide over the instrumentation, coming across as collected, while still being pretty unhinged at times. It's only 9 tracks and 45 minutes long, but I come away from it feeling like I just watched a 3-hour stage show that made me laugh, love, pray, and weep. This is one of those classic albums that I think deserves 100% of the praise that comes its way. It was released a whole 6 months before Nirvana's Nevermind, which according to some world calendars is when the 90s actually started, and yet I feel like it brilliantly embodies the entire angst-ridden sound of the decade in such a one-of-a-kind way. The band establishes a distinct way of structuring songs, starting with a backing rhythm built around an unconventional time signature with a spoken word piece on top, before crescendoing into this noisy, manic-depressive state. They mess with this structure throughout the album just enough to maintain its distinction, while keeping each track refreshing and unpredictable from the last. The lyrical topics range from losing your virginity to not being able to piss, and the way this album depicts trauma and loss of innocence in such an intimate yet poetic way has definitely made it stand the test of time. There's no other rock album that really sounds like this, despite how much it's gone on to blatantly influence a ton of other bands, especially recently, and it does it all while maintaining a conventional palette of instruments.
Once had a fetish for some booty.
Speaking of lauded classics, Low End Theory still holds up tremendously to this day. There really isn't a ton to say about it that hasn't been said already, but everything that's been said about it is true. The beats on here were revolutionary for 1991, putting more emphasis on thick bass lines that often take up the song's lead melody, like on Buggin' Out and Check the Rhyme, as well as jazz samples that are so well integrated with the rhythms that it feels more like I'm listening to a live band rather than a bunch of samples. Tribe were really captivating as MCs as well, with Q-Tip's laid back and kind of nasal voice perfectly playing off of Phife Dawg's confident bars about busting nuts in your eyes. They were a bunch of goofy dudes who didn't seem to take themselves too seriously, and yet they made some of the coolest and smoothest music in the genre. There's some really interesting topical tracks on here as well, like Show Business about the dangers of the industry, Everything is Fair speaking on the crime in New York City, and What, which is about what? My only real issue with this album is that I think lyrically track 8 hasn't aged all that well. I get that it was progressive for the time and clearly had good intentions behind it, but the way they talk about this very serious issue just kind of rubs me the wrong way. It doesn't ruin the album for me, but it's certainly worth noting. Frankie Knuckles, aka The Messiah, is someone who I think still doesn't get the credit he deserves for being such an instrumental part of the development of house music. While it's never really been an album's genre, a lot of people consider Beyond the Mix to be a classic for how well it fused Chicago and hip house at a time when both of those genres were still relatively new. However, my favorite thing to come from Frankie Knuckles is this 1-hour snippet of a live set that he did at Ministry of Sound. It's an entirely bootlegged album that someone uploaded to the internet at some point, and I've actually seen some controversy as to whether it came out in 91 or 92. There's actually multiple uploads of it on YouTube, with a 70-minute version claiming 1991 and an hour and 40-minute version claiming 1992, with a track list that changes after song 9 and flows even better. It's more likely that this is the real version and that it was actually recorded in 1992, but regardless of when it came out and which version you listen to, this is probably my favorite piece of dance music ever recorded. It's a brilliant DJ mix that brings together tracks from a bunch of different house artists at the time and sees them reimagined into this long-form, seamlessly progressing set. It doesn't lose any momentum for its entire runtime, and something about hearing a bootlegs live show for a genre that's mainly engaged with in large social settings makes it feel more like a definitive crash course in Chicago house than any studio album from around that time. I can't recommend this enough if you're a fan of house music or just looking for another reason to live.
No more breath in my hair or ladies' underwear.
I made a whole video on this album a couple years ago, so don't watch it probably sucks. Down Colorful Hill goes about 90s alt-rock in a way that's slow, minimal, and long-winded, with the songs mostly being in the 5 to 10 minute range. It's often labeled as slowcore, a type of alt-rock that encompasses the slower and softer sounds of bands like Galaxy 500, Duster, and Low, just to name a few. But for me, this album stands out a lot from others that get this label. It's a watertight 6 tracks that are each heavenly meditations on growing older, losing contact with old friends, complicated relationships, and being an angsty piece of shit. The guitar tones are spot on and create an atmosphere that feels larger than the sum of its parts, with the drumming acting as a soft, pillowy mattress, giving all of it some sense of progression. It's not an album that's instantly catchy so much as it slowly reels you in and immerses you into its world. It's the complete flip side of grunge, being deliberately quiet and vulnerable, but still carrying all of the emotion. This album smells like the 90s. Ween is basically what happens when you take two musical geniuses and have them make shitposts. Nearly every album of theirs has at least 24 different genres of music being explored every 3 tracks, with their early 90s output being particularly brown. Godwin Satan has a lot of noise rock that's very self-aware of how left of center it is, to the point where it sounds like a parody at times. But then it has the track Let Me Lick Your which, on top of being hilarious, is a brilliantly performed funk song. The Pod is probably the least accessible of their main discography because it starts with the sounds of cymbals building up into a song that just never starts, and has a track where a guy just orders food from a Mexican restaurant for 2.5 minutes.
I would like a side of guacamole on my tostitos. I like to dip the tostitos in the guacamole.
My favorite from this era of their career, though, is Pure Guava, as it goes for something more consistently psychedelic, which I think fits them really nicely. They spend the album constructing this ridiculously campy vibe that's so well thought out and catchy that you kinda just accept it. A good example of this is the lead single, Push the Little Daisies, as on its own, it's kind of an obnoxious novelty song with chipmunked vocals and a bossa nova beat. However, once you hear it in context of the album after the first 4 songs, it just kind of makes sense and becomes one of the catchiest things ever. Australia knows how to party! This whole album feels like I'm looking at rock music through the lens of every psychedelic drug possible, and I seriously can't get enough of it. I love how nonsensical most of the lyrics are, how muddy the bass tones sound, and I mean, just listen to this solo. They do this all without giving up the eclecticism that they're known for, spanning glam rock, hip-hop, dub, and there's even a 5-minute noise song in there just for good measure. I don't know if this is necessarily the best album to start with if you're not already familiar with this band, but fuck it, listen to it anyway. None. No 10 out of 10 albums came out in 1993 for me. Sorry! Plexture by John Oswald is probably my favorite album that came out that year because it's so goofy, but still isn't quite a 10 out of 10. Here's a few 9s that came out that year though. Next! Before we get into this album, I just want to say that 1994 was an insane year for music. So many genre-defining masterpieces came out this year in the world of hip-hop, rock, electronic, metal, noise, and whatever John Frusciante was doing. Rest in peace to Kurt, though. The first album from this year that I want to talk about is Fear Itself by Casual. Casual was part of the Hieroglyphics crew, alongside guys like Souls of Mischief, Del the Funky Homo Sapien, and Snoop. They had this uniquely bouncy and cartoonish approach to rapping that's still captivating on a technical level. Fear Itself is my personal favorite album to come from this collective, and is one of my favorite hip-hop records, period. It has such a distinct sound that makes me feel like I'm watching some sort of adult Looney Tune, with the way that various jazz motifs pop in and out of these slapsticky grooves, while casual rap's about cucking you. Oftentimes, jazz rap is focused on sounding really smooth, dense, and classy, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with. We'll get to you in a second. But it's really refreshing to hear jazz rap that captures more of a rubber hose type of vibe. There's guest features from other Hieroglyphics members all over the album, giving it a feeling of camaraderie, and every single one of the 16 tracks here contributes something great. I'm not a big metalhead generally, in fact this is the only album in the genre showing up in this video, but sometimes I get in the mood to completely
Enter the void.
Very few genres are as therapeutic and emotionally stimulating for me as black metal, as the slow, heavy guitar riffs recorded on a Fisher-Price microphone and the throaty growls are really relaxing for me. Albums like Philosophum, Das Tor, and Exercises in Futility are peak laying in bed staring at the ceiling channeling all of the inner darkness in my soul music. While I'm not that deep into black metal, In the Nightside Eclipse is one of my all-time favorites. It's less lo-fi and more rich compositionally than a lot of other music in the genre, especially for the time. Yet the atmosphere is still built immaculately. Pretty much every track gives me chills and makes me feel physically colder when I listen to it. Relative to some of the more atmospheric records in the genre, the songs on here aren't that long and move at a pace that's more akin to prog metal, yet it's still such an easy record to zone out and get completely sucked into. It's especially great during the winter when it's 0.2 degrees and pitch black outside at 5 p.m. Few albums have emotionally moved me as much as this one, and I'd recommend it to anybody who's a fan of Castlevania. Speaking of entering the void, The Downward Spiral by Trent Reznor and the Trent Reznors is every bit as great as everyone says it is. It was a cutting-edge record for industrial rock and is the most commercially successful album in that genre, yet it still sounds like a completely uncompromised vision with its focused concept, brutally dark lyricism, and noise passages that sometimes go on for minutes at a time. Even the catchiest and most famous track, Closer, is a dirty, sweaty cry for help disguised as an industrial sex jam that sounds nothing like any other hit song that came out that year. Conceptually, this album is fairly simple, being a slow descent into losing all will to live, but it's executed so perfectly. The deeper in the tracklist you go, the further down the spiral you are, with the first 5 songs having mostly conventional structures and memorable hooks, the middle section being a bit longer and noisier, before ending with some of the darkest music of the era. It's then all tied together with Hurt, which I view as the credits rolling after the death of our protagonist on the title track. While we're talking about Hurt though, I'll acknowledge the elephant in the room and say that I do actually prefer this version to the cover by Mumford & Sons. We're gonna start this next one with a take that's gonna get me in trouble. I don't think that the first selected Ambient Works album is all that great. Like, I get that for 1992, it was extremely forward-thinking and changed the landscape of electronic music for people who tried in school, but every subsequent album released under the Aphex Twin name takes this foundation and does more interesting things with it, in my opinion. Richard D. James' album is catchier and more watertight. I Care Because You Do is a bit more psychedelic. And Drux is probably the best showcase of everything this guy's capable of, spanning pretty ambience, ear-shredding glitchiness, and everything in between. Saw 2, though, is one of my most listened to albums of all time, mostly because number 3 helps me focus on homework, and I have it on repeat every time I have to write a paper, and it adds up over time. But the other 23 songs are also pretty okay, I guess. Bits aside, this is maybe the most perfect ambient album that I've ever heard. I know some of you are gonna look at the 2-hour and 40-minute runtime and start quaking in your boots a little bit, but I don't see it as an album that's meant to be listened to in its entirety in one sitting. In fact, I see it more as a playlist of different ambient tracks that encompass a wide variety of moods that can be selected and listened to on a loop until you get tired of it. There's a song for every occasion, with some standouts for me being the snowy and blissful number 17, the gentle lullaby that is number 7, and the ultimate banger for the library that is number 19. I know all of these songs actually do have names, but they're untitled on streaming and I never bothered to learn them all.
Stop fucking around and be a man. There ain't nothing out here for you.
Yeah, Illmatic's a 10. Of course it is. It's Illmatic. Are you fucking serious? I don't even need to say anything. Every single beat is inarguably one of the most iconic boom bap beats of all time, and there is not a single word of filler in any of these verses. Sure, it might be easy to take for granted and see as a bit meat and potatoes nowadays, with how thoroughly hip-hop has been experimented with, and there's even other albums in the genre that came out the same year that I personally have more attachment to and find more interesting musically. but this is still a completely flawless album that deserves its place among the all-time greats.
About to die from thirst, that's when a minute stop. Quench my jaws with a cold glass of vinegar.
This is the ultimate Halloween album in my opinion. Gravediggaz is a supergroup consisting of Prince Paul, aka The Undertaker, Fruquan from Stetisonic, aka The Gatekeeper, RZA, more like The Resurrector, and Poetic, better known as The Grim Reaper. Given the talent involved, it's not surprising that this album turned out as great as it did. We're basically hearing a bunch of hip-hop legends, who are arguably all in their prime, coming together to create what is probably the most essential East Coast horrorcore album ever made. The beats on here are all a little spooky, while still being sample-based and boom-bap-centric, the way Prince Paul and RZA beats are, but what really brings the album to life are the vocals. Each MC takes on a different persona, and brilliantly plays off of each other. Gatekeeper is the most level-headed of the group, acting as a narrator driving the songs forward. Grim Reaper is the comic relief, giving us a lot of dark humor and sounding like he hasn't seen any sunlight in 6 years. And Resurrector sounds the most tortured, giving us the most graphic imagery on the record. It's a dynamic that's able to stay refreshing for the album's entire 50-minute runtime, and is just a very one-of-a-kind take on boom bap that I don't think any other album has quite been able to replicate. Some highlights include the eerie and tongue-in-cheek 1-800-Yeah, the suspenseful posse cut Graveyard Chamber, and my favorite track, Diary of a Madman, where RZA gives one of the most insane rap verses that I've ever heard. Manic Street Preachers are a band that I'm mostly pretty indifferent towards, but The Holy Bible is arguably the best written alternative rock album of all time in my opinion. Not only because it's one of the very few albums where I was able to vividly remember every single hook after only hearing it a few times, but also because the lyrics touch on really dark and serious topics that are very uncommon in music like this. The opening track, Yes, is sung from the perspective of a prostitute, and they seriously pull no punches. 4 State 7 Pounds vividly describes the heartbreaking mental state of someone with anorexia, and Archives of Pain is a pro-death penalty song, where the hook is just a list of politicians and serial killers who deserve to die. A lot of the lyrics were written by the band's rhythm guitar player at the time, Richie Edwards, who unfortunately would go missing not even a year after the album's release and was never found. It seriously blows my mind how much this band is able to say on each song, while keeping each verse pretty concise and extremely catchy. Somehow the dark lyricism doesn't clash with the catchiness either, as I think musically this album has a pretty moody feel to it as well. It's largely in line with a lot of other alt-rock bands at the time, and probably isn't going to blow your mind with new sounds that you've never heard before, but it's a pure masterpiece of songwriting, and continues to amaze me every time I go back to it.
I am your favorite horse.
Before Bonnie Prince Billy was known as Bonnie Prince Billy, he hallucinated a brother and released music with him. The second studio album by alt-country legend Will Oldham, titled Palace Brothers, or Days in the Wake, depending on who you voted for, is one of the most raw, intimate, and depressing albums that I have ever heard. There's very little going on outside of Will and his acoustic guitar. He actually does have a couple brothers that add some percussion and backup vocals on a couple of the songs. And something about his approach to songwriting just touches my soul in a way that stands out a lot. It's kind of like AJJ in the way that it constantly goes back and forth between really blunt, poignant songwriting and borderline nonsense. But it's portrayed in a very somber way that makes it all the more powerful. The guitar lines are empty and sparse. The various lyrical motifs involving animals and spirituality help to paint a picture of a broken person looking for something to cling onto. And the vocal delivery ties it together as perfect sad cowboy music. It's a personal favorite of mine that I think packs a lot into its 27-minute runtime.
I pop my junk, I pop my junk, I pop my junk, pop my junk.
Diggable Planets were a jazz rap trio that only lasted long enough for a couple of albums, but that was all they needed. Their debut album, Reachin', established themselves as a breath of fresh air from their contemporaries, with each member flowing in a way that bordered the line between the rhythmic cadences of rapping and the stilted monologue of spoken word poetry. It also had their biggest single, Rebirth of Slick, which won them a Grammy and has gone on to become one of the most iconic tracks in the genre. Though their follow-up Blowout Comb wasn't nearly as commercially successful at the time, it's gone on to become the more acclaimed album in retrospect. It uses both samples and live instrumentation simultaneously a lot of the time, and it makes for some of the darkest and densest music in the entire genre. If you're looking for some serious gourmet jazz rap, it doesn't get much better than this. Earthbound and Mother 3 are my two favorite games of all time, with the former having my favorite soundtrack. It was so great, in fact, that the game had to be put on a thicker cartridge, which jacked up the price and caused it to fail commercially, and is the reason Mother 3 isn't officially translated. It's one of the most eclectic soundtracks of the era, capturing the abstract take on Americana that the game is going for beautifully, whether that be through the bluesy, smoky acoustics of Humoresque of a Little Dog, the new age retro hippie theme that pulls from Johnny B. Good, and the weird Moonside theme that sneaks in a snippet of the national anthem. Every song just perfectly captures the distinctive vibe of each environment in the game, like the quiet and jangly Tenda Village, the vast and tribal Deep Darkness, and the absolutely kick-ass final boss theme that I can't believe they fit on a Super Nintendo. Pretty much every track in the game just instantly stuck in my head the first time I played it, which is a testament to how well designed and memorable every location is. If you haven't played it yet, I strongly encourage you to do so, unless you have no patience at all and just want to listen to the soundtrack on its own, which is also a valid option.
Now everybody in the hood know that your sister lick a booty real good.
Big Time Volume 2 All Screwed Up, often listed as All Screwed Up Volume 2, even though that implies the existence of an All Screwed Up Volume 1, when in reality Volume 1 is another Big Time compilation called Still Afloat, and this one is called All Screwed Up, is one of my favorite things ever. DJ Screw still doesn't get the credit he deserves for not only being such a great curator and having a very distinct sound, but for essentially laying the groundwork for all slowed down internet fuckery. All Screwed Up is probably his most famous mix, and for good reason. This thing is mesmerizing. He takes some of the wildest tracks from four of Houston's biggest rap acts at the time, and makes them all flow together into this monstrous mindfuck that is beyond description. I know some of the lyrics might be a bit much for some people, especially on Tell Me Something Good and Pregnant Pussy, but honestly, the morbid absurdity in these tracks matches the production so perfectly that I wouldn't have it any other way. It's truly the definitive Houston rap project, showcasing the distinctly slow, melodic, and charismatic flow the city's known for, alongside some of the coolest production that you'll ever hear on a record.
The things that you tell yourself, they'll kill you in time.
Elliott Smith is my favorite artist of all time because I'm a sad little boy. While I think Roman Candle was an excellent debut, showcasing how well his songwriting talents could be applied to something more stripped back than what he was doing in Heat Miser, his self-titled follow-up is his first true masterpiece and is arguably his best album. It's here where he perfected his down-tuned, deceptively simple guitar lines, double-tracked soft-spoken vocals, and beautifully heart-wrenching yet somewhat cryptic lyricism in a way that doesn't miss a beat for the entire tracklist. It's one of his most minimal records, being entirely acoustic guitar-centric, with a handful of exceptions, creating this buzzing, internal soundscape that sticks with me long after listening. The hooks on here are surprisingly tuneful as well, especially on busier cuts like Coming Up Roses and Christian Brothers. This album is the feeling of walking around a completely silent town at 4 in the morning, with the only light source being a candle and the full moon. We meander through Elliott's mind as he reflects on his issues with addiction, past relationships, and self-worth, from the barren, dusty sounds of Alphabet Town, the nocturnal and mysterious Satellite, and the jittery tension of Southern Belle. My favorite on here, though, is Cyanide Heaven, for how it captures these themes of shutting people out and being either too inebriated or withdrawn to function properly in such a compact and memorable way, with gorgeous backup vocals from Rebecca Gates.
Been out haunting the neighborhood, and everybody can see I'm no good.
It's still arguably the most definitive sad boy with a guitar album to this day, and for good reason.
Joints, blunts, and a bomb. Any which way I can never go wrong.
So, kind of like Diggable Planets, the Far Side were a short-lived jazz rap group that only lasted long enough for a couple of albums. These ones don't count, but their impact is still undeniable. Their debut, Bizarre Ride to the Far Side, is an absolute classic that still stands out as one of the most uniquely campy and charismatic rap albums of the 90s, with songs about Yo Mama jokes and crushing on the teacher. In fact, a lot more people still talk about this album over their follow-up, Labcabin, California, even though in my opinion, this album shits all over that one. The 17 tracks on here are all some of the smoothest, catchiest, and most memorable fusions of hip-hop and neo-soul that have ever been made in my opinion, with even the interludes being pretty great. I guess people still prefer the first one because Labcabin cuts down a bit on the campiness and has more songs about weed and sex, but I think the group's personality still shines through on each track. In fact, a lot of the songs are directly about facing your fears and working on self-confidence, like the opening track Bullshit and the lead single Runnin', for example, which makes the whole album feel a lot cooler while still being vulnerable. We also get a lot of introspective and kind of abstract lyricism on cuts like Why and Devil Music, and even songs with more
cliche topics
are some of my favorites in the genre, with Splatatorium being this gorgeously trippy and calming weed anthem, and The Hustle being this tense and fast-paced track about the hustle. It's just a perfect rap album with a lot of great storytelling, atmosphere building, and some of the most earwormy hooks you'll ever hear. Also, a lot of the songs are produced by Jay Dilla, which is really all I had to say. This is my #1 favorite album of all time ever across all music genres ever. As a result, I'm gonna keep it pretty brief here because I want to explain in more detail as to why that is someday, but I'm not mentally prepared for that right now. To give you the SparkNote version though, I think Sing to God pretty much embodies everything that I love about modern music. It has the ambitious structures of prog, the large-scale instrumentation of big bands, the improvisational solos of jazz, off-the-wall attitude of punk, hooks that are as catchy and memorable as some of the greatest pop songs ever, and that's just scratching the surface. It does this all while sounding completely unique and almost inhuman. I understand if some people think it just sounds like funny circus music or a sped-up Yes record, but in my opinion, there is not a single album that comes even close to this in terms of ambition and execution. I swear this album ruined my life for like a year because I didn't want to do anything other than listen to it. Oh hey, he's back and better than ever. Either Or was the final album that Elliott Smith released on the iconic indie label Kill Rock Stars before selling his soul to Shrek. It was his big commercial breakthrough thanks to a bunch of songs from it being used in Good Will Hunting, and is really the centerpiece of his whole career. Instrumentally, it's a bit more stimulating than his first two, with most of the songs making use of electrical outlets and drums, yet it still maintains the haunting quality of the self-titled. His soft-spoken delivery and subtle guitar lines still carry most of these songs, but the electric instrumentation just helps to enhance the emotion of tracks like Ballad of Big Nothing, Punch and Judy, and Cupid's Trick. The songwriting on here is a lot more political and philosophical than his previous albums, with Rose Parade being about how capitalism makes people parade around and put up a front for the sake of profit, and Pictures of Me about the parasocial nature of having a following. My favorite song on here is 2:45 AM, as it beautifully tackles how it feels to be kept up all night by regrets, and has a really great progression. Some days I prefer the more raw and unsettling sounds of the self-titled, but Either Or is easily on par with it. I remember listening to this album so much in high school that I was able to have it on in the background while writing an essay, and I could sing along with it while fully focusing on what I was writing, which is kind of sad.
This plane is definitely crashing!
There is no other album that defines indie rock from this era as fantastically as this one, in my opinion. The Lonesome Crowded West perfectly balances noisy abrasion with catchy songwriting in a way that a lot of my favorite 90s albums do, but this one just has that personal X factor that brings it up to a 10. Every moment is just so perfectly paced and memorable, with its twinkling guitars reminiscent of Midwest emo, crescendoing into these ear-splitting breakdowns that are still easy to sing along to. Isaac Brock is one of the most unique voices in rock music, sounding like he's 24 and 67 at the same time. The lyrics are cryptic yet relatable, especially on songs like Lounge, Doing the Cockroach, and Polar Opposites. And the production is tastefully raw, yet not lo-fi enough to distract from the songwriting. It's the moment where all the stars aligned and the band just completely perfected their sound, and it makes you feel like you're driving around the country to distract yourself from your own loneliness. The leans more into their cryptic, progressive side on their follow-up, The Moon in Antarctica, which is still a great album in its own right, but I prefer the more stripped-back production and songwriting on this one. Sonic R, baby! Ooh! No list of best 90s albums is complete without this absolute gem, and no, I am not doing a bit. My love for this album is fully unironic. If you're not familiar with Sonic R, it was basically the only Sonic game to be released for the Sega Saturn that wasn't a compilation of already existing games, and was heavily rushed because the game that they were working on ended up being canceled, and they needed something to sell this piece of shit. As a result, it kinda sucks. Controls are broken, there's only 5 maps, the characters are severely unbalanced, and a lot of the textures look pretty rough, even for the time. That being said, there's something about this game that kind of makes me love coming back to it. Its idea of fusing 3D platforming with racing by controlling the characters on foot and having different routes to conquer in each map with collectibles along the way is something that could be really fun if it was executed better. But it being this kind of weird, broken thing that just exists makes it all the more intriguing. The most notable thing about this game, though, in my opinion, is the music and how awesome it is. Producer Richard Jock and singer TJ Davis come together to make 7 of the most infectious, detailed, and melodically captivating Eurodance tunes that I've ever heard. Eurodance isn't really an album genre generally because why would it be? But sometimes it takes making a soundtrack for something to pull together a project of consistent quality. Listen to this while running on the treadmill and tell me it's not a masterpiece.
I say what you wanna be, she said alive. It made me think for a minute, then looked in the eyes.
So kind of like Elliott Smith's Either Or, I think Aquemini could be viewed as the centerpiece of Outkast's career. Their debut, Southern Playalistic, helped to shape the sounds of the South into something smoother and funkier, while their second album, ATLians, was them coming into their own, with their deliberately offbeat flows and futuristic production being highlighted a lot more prominently. Aquemini, though, is right in the middle of their discography, as they further fine-tuned and, in my opinion, perfected the sounds that they were going for on ATLians before delving off into even stranger territory on Stankonia. This is one of the most iconic and timeless Southern rap albums ever made, not only with killer singles like the twangy and laid-back Rosa Parks and the minimal, tension-filled, yet still irresistibly catchy Skew It on the Barbie, but also for how it maintains this distinctly hypnotic and sci-fi-esque fusion of funk, soul, and hip-hop that I've yet to hear replicated on any other record. Each song is just one great idea perfectly executed after another, like Synthesizer, which uses these unsettling robotic vocals and a mischievous beat to illustrate the panic caused by technology evolving too quickly, and it even features George Clinton. Art of Storytelling Parts 1 and 2, which are 2 of the most mesmerizing and replayable storytelling tracks in all of hip-hop, and Spotty Oddie Dopalicious, which makes me feel like I'm at some fancy party in space. It's really hard to talk about this album without just delving into what makes every single track stand out so much, even Mamacita, which I know a lot of people hate on, but I still think it's pretty good. So I'll just tell you to go listen to it if you haven't already. Man, I don't even know where to begin with this one. If you're one of the 7.8 billion people who's probably never heard of Mira Asher, she's an Israeli artist who's made music about some pretty heavy shit that I could probably get demonetized just for mentioning. Her 1999 album Spears into Hooks is probably her most famous work and is seriously one of the best experimental albums that I've ever heard. I know some people have compared her to Diamanda Gallis or Lingua Ignota, but I don't even think that begins to scratch the surface of what she accomplishes here. We get some of the most well-composed, technical, and dare I say catchy noise music on Shahid 1 and 2, ballads that are genuinely cursed on Weekend Away Break and Tiring Night, and even a couple bangers like Dissect Me Again and Viosmear that feel like some post-no-wave shit. She performs in different languages throughout the album and gives us everything from creepy spoken word passages to uncomfortable screaming, and every second of it is just captivating. It's not an album that I return to very often, as it's not a particularly easy listen, but if it sounds up your alley, then it probably is.
S-H-I-T, is that how you spell me?
XTC are one of the comfiest, quirkiest, and edgiest bands of the 80s. They kind of fall in that talking head space where they tend to get labeled as a new wave band for lack of a better term, even though I think their songwriting and performance styles different from a lot of other music you typically associate with new wave. They have so many standout records like Skylarking, English Settlement, and Dukes of Stratosphere, where they pretend to be a different band that parodies psych rock tropes, while still making one of the best albums in the genre, kind of like Sgt. Pepper's, but even better. Apple Venus Volume 1, though, is their first album to be released in 6 years, and is one of their most ambitious projects. The opening track, River of Orchids, is one of my favorite songs ever, as it's essentially structured like a minimalist piece if each musical phrase was a catchy pop hook, and it plays out so brilliantly. The classical instrumental palette helps to bring it all home too, acting as an overture for how the rest of the album sounds, as well as establishing the lyrical motifs of nature, flowers, and performances. From there, we get these really gorgeous and life-affirming chamber pop songs like Easter Theater, Green Man, and Harvest Festival that make me want to go outside and smell the fresh air. Even moments where the songwriting itself is a little rough, like Your Dictionary and I Can't Own Her, are just so pretty sounding that I can't help but love them. It's easily one of my favorite comeback albums of all time, and a kind of last hurrah for the band that takes their songwriting talents in a direction that perfectly fits them, and also because Volume 2 isn't really that great. One of the earliest ideas that I had for this channel that I've yet to follow through on is a video about the Elephant Six Collective, a group of bands from the 90s founded by Apples in Stereo, the Olivia Tremor Control, and Neutral Milk Hotel that brought back the sounds of 60s pop music in a weird, demented way. The complete list of bands associated with this collective is longer than the Constitution, but some of the more interesting ones are the supergroups within it. There's Major Organ in the Adding Machine, Circulatory System, and what is probably the most infamous one, the Music Tapes. Their debut album, First Imaginary Symphony for Nomad, is pretty divisive, and for good reason. It's one of the strangest, most unsettling, and depending on who you ask, obnoxious takes on indie folk that you're probably ever going to come across, but I cannot get enough of it. This album sounds like tripping on acid while looking through a book of drawings by a 5-year-old who had a traumatic childhood. There's moments of straight noise and just weird sounds that I think are coming from toy instruments, alongside hooks that just randomly pop in my head from time to time. The vocals have this weirdly innocent yet deeply tortured delivery, and the way the album stumbles and meanders from track to track is just really fascinating to me. I seriously haven't heard anything that sounds remotely like this, except for maybe other Music Tapes albums, and even though I can definitely see why some people don't like it, I think the world is a much better place because it exists.
For a well-made mistake, I wanna make a mistake. Why can't I make a mistake?
Fiona Apple has been the best living songwriter since Mozart died. Her debut album Tidal was a huge breath of fresh air for music at the time, spanning uplifting vocal jazz, somber balladry, and kick-ass piano rock. When the Pawn isn't all that different stylistically, but it took everything that worked about Tidal and trimmed the fat. It's about 10 minutes shorter despite having the same amount of tracks, and the 42 minutes of music that we get on here is pretty immaculate. Like, if somebody told me this was the most perfect album ever made, I wouldn't even disagree with them. The compositions are huge and detailed, but never too complicated, and the way the instrumentals progress in context of the hooks just makes every track super memorable. Fiona's vocals are pretty yet down to earth with the way that she riffs throughout the album, and the way that she writes songs about toxic relationships and working on herself are relatable in a very poetic and tightly knit way. It's one of the best produced albums of the era as well, with John Bryan making all of these instruments sound crystal clear without getting in the way of the vocals. I don't even really know what else to say about this thing other than that it's one of the easiest albums to recommend to pretty much anybody regardless of what kind of music you like. Also, Paper Bag is my favorite song of all time, baby! So yeah, those are my favorite albums of the 90s. Let me know in the comments how much you hate me for not putting this album or that album, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, you know the drill.